Hello, everyone. My name is McQuaid. I'm so excited to be talking to you all today about modern data fetching in React. This is a tool that's really near and dear to my heart because, frankly, I've had a lot of pain with this in my current role. So a lot of my talks are born out of pain in what I've experienced in the job. So I'm hoping that y'all will share in some of that, and maybe I can provide some solutioning to that problem. So some just facts about me. I'm a software engineer at Chick-fil-A. I lead web platform engineering for our customer technology solutions team. Platform engineering is kind of this weird generic term that's kind of emerged, but it basically boils down to I do a lot of shared tooling and think about patterns that make the developer experience more positive for people that contribute to our team. I was born and raised in Austin, New York. How many people know where that is? One person. How do you know that? Heck yeah, that's awesome. So it's 45 minutes north of New York City. I was a former jazz musician before going into programming, so I'm not a CS major. If you ask me to do a data structures and algorithms interview right now, I'd rather do this than that, for sure. And public speaking is like one of my worst nightmares, believe it or not. I moved to Atlanta about 6 years ago. I'm self-taught via Free Code Camp, and then I did a boot camp afterwards, so Free Code Camp gang, it's awesome. And kind of a fun fact, but I'm a huge pizza snob, or I amended this a few minutes ago because I thought about it, food snob. The Michelin guide just came out for Atlanta, actually. Like, it got announced literally last night after the speaker's dinner, and I was quite upset for 2 hours plus, yelling at my wife about it. And I thought it'd be good to level set about the goal of my talk here, and hopefully we could all walk away from this, but my goal is to address and squash some of the beef that's come up on Twitter recently about data fetching in React. How many of you saw like a tweet about like, I'm never gonna use Next.js 13 again with the app directory? Like, I really don't enjoy this. No one? All right, so basically in the past week, there's been a lot of discourse about React server components, about being a viable solution or not for data fetching, and I'm hoping we can walk away from this talk and all agree that all of the approaches I'm gonna present are perfectly viable, acceptable ways to fetch data, and it's still better than doing it in use effect. So before we get too deep into the talk, it's all the way at the bottom. So I love it. I like audience participation. Some people think it's a little cringe. I enjoy it, so humor me. If this sort of pattern looks familiar to you about how you fetch data in React, please raise your hand. Okay, cool. So this is some historical context, but when hooks first came out, we didn't really have a lot of tooling that handled data fetching effectively. So people's first instinct was, well, I'm gonna do it the same way I did in a class-based component. So they used useEffect, and they would make a data fetching call on mount, essentially, which is what this reads as, basically. And you'd have to load the error state, the data itself, and the error state. The loading, data, and the error state all at once. And it solved the data fetching part effectively, but it didn't solve the other part of the problem, which is caching. So people immediately said, well, I can't cache in this approach, so why not use Redux for this? How many of you know what Redux is or are using Redux in your current role? Sweet, that's way more hands than I thought it would be. And how many of you had a heart attack when I just said the word Redux? Okay, cool. We're gonna also hopefully squash that a little bit later too. But basically, if you actually look at the lines of code, it's the same in terms of the approach. You have some sort of action where you're abstracting out like your different states. So you're gonna, somewhere in a reducer or a slice, whatever you wanna call it, you'd manage the request, the success, and the failure of the request. You do it in this async action, and you would dispatch it in a useEffect. So some of you might be looking at this and saying, well, this is technically doing the job, like it's fetching data effectively, but there's one small big thing that really bothers me about this. And if you were at Corey's talk, I blurted this out when he was asking about it, but server state and client state are not the same thing. They really shouldn't be managed in the same way. And if you look at scalability alone, you're talking about whether it's a Redux store or in your components, you're looking at 3 pieces of state minimum you're managing per request. And I don't know about you, but I don't manage 1 request per page usually. Usually I have 3 to 5 firing off. So you're talking about 9 to 15 pieces of state just for fetching data outside of the client. So server state's way more complex and we need to treat it with respect. And some of you might go, well, I could build something that can handle this effectively. What if I want to do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Here's the laundry list of things you're gonna have to care about now. You're gonna have to care about caching, which is arguably the hardest thing to do in programming effectively, deduping multiple requests for the same data into one request, updating out-of-date data in the background so the user's not aware of it, knowing when data is out of date, reflecting updates to data as quickly as possible, performance optimizations like pagination and lazy loading data, managing memory and garbage collection of server state. I've never touched that in my career, let alone in the browser, so I can't imagine how fun that is. Memoizing query results, and as mentioned, managing the actual state of the request effectively. So I would encourage you, if you're looking at this and you're having a heart attack thinking about building your own hook for this, don't panic. We're going to look at 4 awesome approaches today that solve these problems fairly effectively, and hopefully you'll walk away with something that's beneficial for you and your teams. And before we get into the actual tools, I wanted to get through 2 terms that are kind of synonymous for a lot of the data fetching approaches we're going to talk about today. So how many of you are working in GraphQL right now or have worked in GraphQL? So these terms shouldn't be that crazy, but basically we have queries and we have mutations. Either you're reading data in some way or you're modifying it. So in REST terms, a query is a GET request, or in a mutation, it's a post, put, delete, that sort of thing. So you're either reading data or you're modifying it. So what I'd like to do is I would like to walk through 4 different example repositories that have 4 different approaches we're going to look at. So we're going to look at React or TanStack query at a very high level, Redux toolkit query, and hopefully I could talk about some of the benefits of toolkit in general. We're going to look at the Next.js 13 app directory using React server components, which is kind of a loaded topic right now. And we're going to look at the app directory with React and TanStack query's experimental package for handling hydration, which lets you stream parts of the page just using their hooks. So you don't have to use a server component and get some of the same benefits. So let's start with React query. How many of you have used this library or have heard of it before? All right, sweet. I'm so glad that that number's higher than what I was hoping to. It's often described as the missing data fetching library for React apps. It makes fetching, caching, synchronizing, and updating server state a breeze. And it accomplishes this with 3 major hooks. So use query client, and use mutation. So we're going to look at some code right now that kind of demonstrates that. So I'm first going to show you the app. And before any CSS wizards look at this, I intentionally did not add styling. I'm not here to like style this up and make it look nice. I just want to get through explaining how data is fetched effectively. So let's go in real quick. We're going to get React query. Oop, not DV, dev. Or dev. Okay, there we go. Loading it up. Sweet. So this is a really dinky app. It's using the JSON placeholder API. For those that haven't used it, it's like a great thing to just have as like a fake API you could use to just POC some stuff out. So we're rendering a bunch of lorem ipsum to-dos that are coming back. And if I click this delete button, you'll see a quick flash for loading state. And in the bottom right, I actually have dev tools in here for TanStack query that we'll actually look at a lot closer later. But for those that have not used this tool before, it's actually really helpful to have this in your project. It shows you very effectively when data is stale, when it's getting refetched, if it's fresh, that sort of thing. And it lets you see all the query keys that you have there. So let's start looking at the code. So when I look at any project or any of these demos, I like starting at like the root component and kind of working my way out. So that's how we're going to do it here. So let's pull it up. So the first thing that you have to do if you're going to use React query, you need to have a provider wrapping your entire application with a query client. Now this pattern might look a little different here. So I have my query client living separately. This is also provided by React query. The reason for that, if anyone has messed with React router loaders or actions, you could actually use this query client in those loaders and actions and work with the cache at that level. I'm not going to be doing that in this talk, and that's outside of scope, but that's why I have it abstracted out that way if I did choose to opt into that later. So the query client's pretty cool. You could pass in some default options. So the one I'm really just focused on right now is stale time. Right now, if I were to do a normal request without stale time, it would just get stale immediately. So I have it set for 5,000 milliseconds presently, or 5 seconds. So we have the query client provider. It wraps our entire application. And I have the dev tools added, which again are pretty awesome and show you all the states of the request. It shows you how your data is doing at that point. So let's look at our app. So I tried to keep the code more co-located and less abstracted when I could, just to make it a little easier for to understand what's going on. But you'll notice these 2 hooks here, and we have some data coming through for use get post query, and we have a mutate function in this pending. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the abstraction that I created for use query, and we're going to move our way into mutation. So this is what the JSX currently looks like. We have some data we're getting back, and if we hover over it, we see it's an array of posts, or it could be undefined. And we're mapping over the data here, and we're displaying just like a very amateur list item with some text and the delete button. So one common pattern I like doing with React query is, I mentioned 3 hooks, right? Use query client, and use mutation. I like having my hooks abstracted out for when I'm fetching data, because the way that use query works is you have to provide bare minimum a query key and a query function. That query key is super important, and it's what hoists your current fetched data to a cache. So if we look at the dev tools here, you'll see I have this get posts coming through. And if I click on that, I could see the data here. I could even invalidate it. I could trigger a refetch. Like, it's actually really cool, the things you can do with it. But the point is, I could see the data coming through because I have query keys. And the way I like doing it, and Corey and I actually had a discussion about this a little while ago, I personally like having query keys abstracted out because if I need to reference these query keys in something else later, it's really helpful to be able to invalidate the cache using the same value. So let me go back to the hook real quick. So we have the query here, we have a query key, and we have this post service, which is get posts. I'm a huge fan of the API client pattern. I like having a separate service file where I can make API calls in and have my script types centralized in such a way that I could propagate throughout my app. You guys might not be into this, but that's kind of my preferred way of doing things right now. And I work with a lot of microservices, so I typically have this based per URL usually. So we're making this query call, and if I hover over this, what's kind of cool is, so you can see I have a promise of post coming back. If I hover over the result, the user query result, it's a generic type that takes 2 arguments, the type of the result and the type of the error that's coming back. So in this case, the resolved result of that promise is an array of posts, so we have that coming through. So again, if I hover over this is technically right, so the data could either be undefined, meaning that the request was not successful, or it could have an array of posts to it. And the other part that we want to look at is the mutation part, right? So there's queries and mutations that are occurring. So we have this use, delete, post mutation. I like keeping this abstracted out, helps keep it a little simpler. And what's kind of cool, so some people like hoisting all their state to the root component of like their page or something like that. This is an example where it actually really hurt you to do that. So right now, this use, delete, post mutation, it's in every delete button. So if I click on the individual button, it'll show loading state for just that one button. If I have that hoisted to the top of the component, it's using the same mutation, so you disable every single button on the page at that point effectively. So that's not like a great user experience. So there's like an actual win out of that. So let's look at the use, delete, post mutation real quick. I'm gonna clear this out. Cool, so 3 hooks. Use query client, and use mutation. So we're gonna look at the last 2. So starting with use mutation, technically for this to work, you only need to provide a mutation function. The mutation hook doesn't require a key of any sort because you're really just referencing a query cache. So we have this mutation function where we're defining what parameters we want to pass into our service there. And one kind of cool pattern you can do is if I wanted to invalidate the cache, or if I want to do something like, let's say a very common pattern is I click on that delete and I want to toast a display to the user to say like, hey, that post was deleted successfully. They have an on success callback that you could provide where you can either do anything you want. So in this case, I'm using the use query client hook, which again is one of the 3 hooks I recommend using. It returns the query client you have hoisted to your provider, so you get it from the root level of your app. And you could use that query client, which has the cache, to invalidate queries. So I can invalidate any number of query keys here, and it'll clear the cache out and trigger a refetch automatically. When I was a noob and started doing this, I actually thought I had to have the query and mutation co-located to one another. So I ended up in situations where I was manually refetching the query, and that is not the way they recommended. I found a tweet on Twitter that just changed my mind about it very quickly. And this is kind of the preferred approach that the maintainers recommend. And if you haven't thanked the maintainers before, thank the maintainers. Like Dominic and the team are freaking awesome. They're sweet. So we have this mutation function that comes back, and you'll see here it has a number of things specified, but if we look over this, you can see that we have the type of the arguments that we have in there. So variables is of type number because that's what we defined in the mutation function, and we're able to trigger this on click with the provided ID. And is pending, which is, this actually changed recently in V5. It used to be is loading for mutations, but now it's is pending for that. So that is basically the equivalent of is loading with mutations. It's just, that's just the verbiage they went with. So, and the delete button takes in the ID as a prop, and we are able to click it and just clear the cache once we do that. So you can see it's fresh there, and it's all well and good. So that's React Query at a very high level. I want to keep moving because honestly, we don't have a lot of time to cover everything I'm looking to today. So I'm going to clear this out, and I'm going to go into the next one, which is Redux Toolkit Query. So let me get my slide up real quick for that. Okay, so I asked the room this already, but some of you already had a heart attack when I mentioned Redux, right? So Redux Toolkit is a direct response to the feedback that most of the community gave that there's too much boilerplate when you make a React app or Redux app. So typically, whenever you think about some of these requests, you would have like 3 different states, right? So Redux Toolkit Query is an optional plugin built into Redux Toolkit that's built on the same APIs, so you can actually mix and match different APIs from Toolkit with Query, and it handles data fetching for you, so it handles loading data in the web app or eliminating the need to handwrite data fetching or caching logic yourself, which is great. And again, the functionality is built on top of other APIs and Toolkit, so you're able to like mix and match. So like, let's say for some reason I wanted to infinitely cache some data. That is something you can do with Toolkit Query, and you could just have it live in your Redux store at that point, and we're going to look at an example of that right now. So let me run pnpm dev. And this is going to look eerily similar, right? Like we're going to use the exact same app example basically throughout. So we have this list of posts coming through, click on delete, it's showing loading for that. So let's go straight to the code. I don't want to dig too much into the same functionality there, not React Query. There we go. So starting at the main app. For those that haven't worked in Redux, there's this concept of a central store that manages state, and it has different portions of the store that handles specific functionality and how you define it. So the way you think of it is in reducers or slices, however you want to define it, it's just different parts of an object that are basically at a high level functions that handle actions from a user, and it stores the result somewhere. So let's look at the store first. So Redux Toolkit comes with this configure store function. It used to be a lot uglier with the old APIs, so this is great. You pass in the root reducer, and the important thing with Toolkit Query is you need to append any middleware from the actual APIs you create with Toolkit Query to the store. Otherwise, it's not going to listen to it appropriately and be able to respond. So we have this get default middleware function, which again is provided by Toolkit, and we're just concatenating on the middleware from our post API. So the root reducer, it's again all of our pieces of state we're looking to combine. So we have here our post API with our reducer path and the reducer from the post API. And I have a post slice that we're going to look at in a bit that'll demonstrate some of the powerful capabilities of being able to combine Toolkit Query with Toolkit. So let's start with the post API. And you'll notice I don't have a services directory in this project. And the reason for that is we could collate our code pretty easily in Toolkit Query. So here they provide you out of the box this create API function where you could pass in a reducer path, the base query you'd like. So in this case, they give you a fetch base query with a base URL, and you're able to define endpoints for each service. So this is really great because, again, if you're using the API client pattern and thinking of it that way, for one microservice, you could just have these APIs created off of that. So walking through the code a little bit, you'll notice at the bottom, I had previously abstracted the same named hooks before, right, with React Query. Toolkit Query code generates for you hooks for each of these endpoints, which is absolutely sick. So I don't have to go out and abstract any of this out myself. It is provided to me by Toolkit Query. So at the top, we have tag types. So this kind of goes back to how I had abstracted out query keys before. So the cool thing about Toolkit, and Lens and Mark maintain it, and they're both sick. They're like both insane TypeScript wizards. And part of the benefit of their experience that comes in is this tag types array. What we provide to it is actually enforced very heavily throughout the rest of the API here. So watch this. I'm going to put in, for some reason, I want to have a type of flarb. And I'm going to get screamed and yelled at because type of flarb does not align with anything provided to the tag types array. So you're not going to fat finger like a wrong query key at that point, which is really nice. So that's like super awesome and saves a bunch of time by itself. And we have two different things here. We have a query and we have a mutation, similar to the services we created before, but this get post query, we're able to pass in, it's a generic function, so you pass in the type argument you'd like, so in this case, an array of posts. And the second one is the argument that you're passing in. So in this case, we're passing in nothing. The query, we're passing in the URL we'd like, and we're providing tags. So we're mapping over the result, we're grabbing the ID from the posts, and we're basically getting an array back of type posts with the ID appended to it. If not, we're not providing anything. And this is kind of the cool part. So before we had to use two hooks to accomplish invalidating the cache, but with Toolkit Query, all you have to do is for the mutation, you write a normal query in the mutation, similar arguments. The first one's the return that you'd like, and the second one's the argument you'd like to provide. But then all you have to do is add this invalidate tags array and put whatever you want in there, and that's that. It'll auto trigger refetch for you, which is pretty sweet. So I'm gonna quickly just restart that real quick, and I'm just gonna show it in DevTools. Cool, already have that up. So if I go in here, for those that don't have Redux DevTools and you're working in Redux every day, I would highly encourage you to download them. They're awesome, total lifesaver for looking at what's going on in the store. So you'll see this is all from when I first loaded the app. We have the post API firing off. We have like query getting executed. And when it's fulfilled, if we actually click into here and we look at the queries for get posts, status fulfilled, and we have the data here. So now if I click on the delete button, you'll see that mutation just got kicked off, but what follows, like the query gets executed for get posts right away. So we are not handling any sort of like caching, clearing on our own. It is fully managed by Redux Toolkit Query at that point, which is sick. Now, there might be cases like one that comes to mind is for user authentication, right? Like let's say we have a token coming back and we don't want to fetch the token every single time we want to make a request, right? So one way we can accomplish that is we can actually use Toolkit Query's APIs in combination with what Toolkit provides to infinitely cache something. So let's look at the code for that real quick, and then I'm going to show you DevTools and how that works. So right now, we have the Post API here. If we go into Post, the slice here, so this is, again, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. This is just a very like basic example of how we could do this, but we have a post slice here with an interface. We have an array of posts that we're going to store, initial state of empty. And normally you'd have reducers here that are based on user action, but I'm not looking to really address that. This isn't a talk about Redux, really. This is a talk about what Toolkit Query can do for you. So in this case, you can add an extra reducer that can be triggered when you match fulfilled, which means that the request was successful, and you can infinitely cache it. So if I hover over the payload, it's an array of posts. So I want to just take a minute and like marvel at that, because I didn't have to add any extra TypeScript types to any of that. It's just getting auto-filled in from what I already provided to Toolkit Query before. So I'm able to infinitely cache this list of posts if I wanted to, and I could read it from a selector at that point instead of query. So if I wanted to, so let me pull it up. I'll show you in DevTools. If I look at posts, I have an array of posts here that have been populated. I did not have an action that did that. Toolkit Query did that for me and just threw it into Redux, which is sick. So again, in the case of authentication, I think there's a strong use case for that sort of deal if you'd like to have that there. Okay, so that's Toolkit Query, and now we're going to go on to the one that I'm actually really stressed to talk about. So we're going to be looking at server components and what they kind of look like right now in Next.js. So before we get into this, let me get the slide up. Okay, so Next.js's app directory and React Server Components, specifically React Server Components, they're a direct response to the feedback that the community has given to the React team that there isn't a built-in way to handle asynchronous requests in React. People had to reach for use effect when things started out. They didn't have to reach for like a built-in tool, which is kind of a miss on their part. And most people don't know this, but this was actually announced back in 2020, and obviously 2020 was a little bit of a blur of a year for some of us, but it was announced prior to any frameworks really starting to implement them. So it's built in React, like frameworks just have the choice to integrate with them. To my knowledge, the Next team is the first and only framework right now to integrate with it, but I know some of the guys on the Remix team and they're working on their implementation right now at some point, but they're waiting until RSCs hit more of like a stable place. And we're gonna talk about what makes them production ready and what parts are not production ready in a moment. Okay, so some of you might be sitting here and saying to yourself, what's a server component? I've never heard what that is before. At an extremely high level, it is something that allows you to write UI or JSX that can be rendered and optionally cached on purely the server. This means you can write components that can be rendered on the server without having to worry about client-side JavaScript getting sent down to the browser. And by default, Next.js defaults to server components unless you include the use client directive at the top of the file to mark it as a client component. I promise you I'm going to break down what that is too. And some high-level benefits of what a server component could do for you. It makes data fetching or any asynchronous operations, they could be handled in the component. So if you wanted to get really spicy, and I'm not saying this is right, if you wanted to do like a SQL query in a component, you could hypothetically do that. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but it is an option, which is pretty cool. It leads to smaller bundle sizes because you're not sending as much JavaScript down to the client, which is pretty sick. You'll get a better initial page load and first contentful paint, which is great for performance scores and better for our users. And this is really sick. You could stream data from the server to the client. So what that means is, and people throw out streaming and then don't explain anything about it, it basically means that you could send parts of the page earlier without having to wait for the entire page to load. With server rendering, in some cases, you have to wait for the entire page to load. So this gives you the option to, you know, on Twitter, when you go on it, you have like multiple spinners going. You could have those as different server components and have them rendering in the background while the whole page gets loaded. Okay. Now, what's a client component? So this is a huge misnomer, and people thought immediately when they heard client component that it only means it runs on the browser. Total falsity, is not true. A client component is actually still rendered on the server. They're just also rendered on the client at request time. It allows you to write UI or client-side JavaScript, or interactive UI and client-side JavaScript, and it's first rendered on the server and then hydrated with JavaScript in the browser. So who has heard of the term hydration before? Who actually knows what it means? Okay, cool. Basically, imagine like the page is like a bed of soil and you're just watering it with JavaScript. Like you're loading the page up and then it adds interactive JavaScript to it. So the server still renders the HTML and whatever else with it, but then it goes to the client and it adds the JavaScript afterwards. It's why people talk a lot about progressive enhancement, because the hydration step, if JavaScript is disabled, your page could not be interactive. It's why frameworks like Remix have really taken off, because they put progressive enhancement in front. And I want to squash that because I'm a huge Remix fan, and I'm sure there's someone in the back that's like, oh man, why are you not talking about Remix today? If Remix had built-in caching, I would be talking about it right now. And I love Remix to a fault in some ways, but I don't think it's fair to bring that up when I'm looking at tools that have caching built in, and that's usually a common problem for teams. So in Next.js, you need to include the use client directive in the file to mark it as a client component to define the boundary between the server and the client. If you look at the docs for this, and I've looked at them a lot in the past few weeks, it is littered with that term, the boundary between the server and the client. That's all it's doing. It's marking, hey, this is going to run in the browser. If you don't have it, it's going to run purely on the server. So by defining a use client in the file, all the other modules imported into it, including child components, are then included in part of the child bundle as well, or the client bundle. So that has a performance implication to it, but there's a lot of nuance to when you should use one or the other we're going to go into in a sec. So at a very high level for a guide, if you start looking at this, these are kind of like two ways to think about it. If you need CSS and JS, like styled components or something like that, interactivity of some sort, state management, hooks, or any client-side JavaScript, you're going to want to reach for a client component. But if you can get away with not using them, reach for a server component. It has clear performance implications. However, that's very high level, and there's a ton of nuance to this conversation that's still getting figured out. So the best practices are still being determined today. There are cases, actually, and I learned this directly from Dan Abramov, who slapped me on the wrist for saying this originally, because when Next.js first announced server components, the way it read was always use a server component if you can. And I was at dinner at RemixConf with Dan Abramov and JP from the Hydrogen team from Remix, and I let that out, and Dan immediately all but just like slapped me in the face and was like, no, absolutely not. That is not true. There are cases where the size of the HTML payload can actually exceed the size it would have just taken to fetch the data on the client. So it would actually be more performant to use a client component instead. And naturally, my response was like, Dan, that's not documented anywhere. Nobody knows that. Why is that not out there? And his response is, we're missing profiling tooling that is needed to determine this. So that's where some of the Remix team has merit in saying this isn't as production ready, because we don't have that tooling today to determine that. So now that we've kind of like set a baseline for what it is, I'd love to show you just a very high level demo of what it looks like. So we're gonna pull up, let me get rid of that. Okay, pull up localhost. Okay, and this will not look that different. We're gonna have a couple things here, but same deal. I use Tailwind at default. I'm not saying if I'm team Tailwind or not. Let's be clear, like I'm not taking a side on that argument. I don't want to start another fist fight in the room or something like that. So we have a list of posts. If I click delete, it's also gonna show loading here. And I have some artificial lag added to kind of highlight that a little bit more. So let's look at the root of the application real quick. So SRC, so the root of any Next.js 13 app, it's in the app directory, it's kind of in the name. And the home page is page, but what we're gonna first look at is the layout. That's what determines what wraps the whole app. And you'll notice here, I don't have any providers, I don't have anything extra added. This is just provided by Next. So I don't have to add a third-party dependency to fetch any data. It's just included with Next. And one kind of nice thing with Next is with error and loading states, it's just handled for you. So you could have like a loading.tsx or whatever at the root of your project, the root of your app directory, and it'll just handle loading states for the entire page. And you can get more granular with it in the individual page as well if you'd like. And then you have an error.tsx that'll handle that too. So we look at the home page. So I mentioned that I tried to keep it co-located. This is a case where you can't do that. So I'm going to show the code for the delete button in a second why we can't do that. But right now, we have this page, and you'll notice this funky async await here. That should look weird to everyone in the room. Like, asynchronous components did not exist until this paradigm came out, and this is kind of the magic of server components. So when you use a server component, you have the option to use async await to do asynchronous operations. So in this case, I have a post service that's returning a promise of posts. It's iterating over that, and it's displaying that. And this might look a little funky to some of you that have not coded in like pre-React HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. How many people in here have done like server-side rendered like Express app JS before? Cool. So that form shouldn't look unfamiliar to y'all, but back in the day before React was really prevalent, the way that data was communicated from client to server was through form data. So it's funny, like the JS ecosystem has this constant battle of like back and forth between client boundaries and server boundaries, but we're right back in server land now, which is pretty cool. So we have this form wrapping our delete button and this input of type hidden. How many people know what input of type hidden is or have seen that before? Cool, yeah, so not surprising, one of the people that's worked in like server-side rendered before has seen that. So basically it lets you pass in a value in form data without having an input displayed. So this is gonna be a really common pattern when you're working with Next, because the way that they communicate mutations to the server is they use forms typically in form actions. So you'll notice here I have this delete post abstracted out, and we're gonna look at that. So you'll notice that use server directive here. I didn't mention that yet. This is specific not to Next.js, but to React server actions themselves. So this is something that the React team requires you to mark if it's gonna be a server action or not. And this is where we're getting into experimental land, because right now server actions are still in alpha. They are not production ready yet, and the Next team is actually in the midst of figuring out how they're integrating with it. So I'm not sitting here telling you to go and use this. I'm just showing you that this is likely what the API will look like in the future as they round the corner on it. So we have this use server directive, which marks that it's gonna run on the server. Weird thing about that, you can actually inline that in a function. So you could have like a use server directive in a client component. I don't like that pattern very much. It makes my brain go to mush, so I like having things abstracted out and a little separate here. So it's really clear. We have delete posts, we have form data coming in, we're getting an ID, I added an artificial sleep here, we're deleting the post, and we're revalidating the tag. And I know what you're thinking, I haven't mentioned tags yet. Well, Next has their own special way of doing things with this, and this is kind of where they lost some of the community, honestly. So Next right now, what they do is they actually monkey patch the global fetch right now to allow them to do some stuff. So if you want to cache data with Next, you have the option to add this Next header with a tags array. So of whatever query keys you add, I still have those abstracted query keys from before, and I have a revalidate time, which is in seconds. So in 60 seconds, it'll be stale in the Next cache. Now, I'm gonna fault the Vercel team a little bit because they used to have something in the dev server where you could see a cache hit or a cache miss, and they removed that in like 2 releases ago, and I want them to bring it back so badly because now it's harder to tell if it hit the cache or not. But you have this query key here, and we're revalidating after 60 seconds. And if you don't want to cache at all, you have to include cache no store to prevent caching in Next. So we're calling revalidate tag, which is basically grabbing the query key that we have marked there. It's using a function here, it's clearing the cache, and then it's gonna trigger a refetch here. So kind of a weird thing with it though that I'm not as big a fan with. If I click on that delete right now, it's gonna have like a slight flicker you could see of like the loading state coming up. I think that UX is not optimal, and I think the Next team still has some work to do to make that a little bit more seamless. So that's server actions, but the real meat and potatoes of what I talked about is that boundary between server and client. So the reason I have this delete button abstracted out is not for my own health. So, all right, ignore the TypeScript error. The definitely typed repo right now, there's a PR up for getting types in for the experimental use form status hook, but it's not resolved yet, and I think Sebastian and team are literally arguing about it as I speak, probably. So this is a hook that we need. So we need client-side JavaScript of some sort. We're using some form of state management we need to have on the client. So I had to have this delete button abstracted out to do that. Otherwise, that entire page would be a client component. I couldn't use server components at that point. So we have this experimental use form status hook that lets us grab if it's pending or not. That's a Boolean. You're just gonna have to believe me on that. And we have a button of type submit because we're using a form and we're submitting data down. And if it's pending, we're displaying loading, and if not, we delete it. So that's like at a very high level, like querying and mutating with server components. But the other part was something I mentioned about streaming before. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to click on this multiple suspense page real quick. It's going to kick off 2 different loadings. So we're going to see one post stream in and the other one's going to come in shortly after it. And I'm not doing anything too fancy there. If we look at the code, actually, it's pretty rudimentary, honestly. We have like a server page here, or a server component, and we have like an H1 link, right? But then what's this? Suspense. So suspense is something that's built into React that allows streaming. Fun fact, if you wanted to be cool and like build your own data fetching tool to integrate with suspense, all you have to do is throw a promise, but you just have to follow a very specific data contract with that to trigger it. So Next has done that here. And when you use a server component, if you have, so I'm going to show you this component real quick, but this is just another server component. I abstracted it out to make it a little clearer what's going on. But in here, I have sleep running, and then I have this get post service, and we're displaying it for the user. So I have some artificial lag added again, just to kind of highlight as the data is streaming in. But here, as it's falling back, we have 2 loading states going. So again, it's really powerful because you could have nested server components and make different parts of your page display at different times and make parts interactable to the user. And if some of them fail, if you had a catch boundary around it, you could still have parts of the page that are able to be interacted with, which is pretty sick. So multiple suspense is super powerful. I don't think that gets talked about enough. I think people really focus on like, I could do it at the page level. I think if any of you went to Corey's talk this morning, if you do anything just at the index level or just at the page level, it could lead to performance issues. So I would encourage you to think in multiple suspense terms if you start looking at data fetching with Next 13. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the last example I have, which I can like unapologetically say this is absolutely experimental. The maintainers of React Query will come out and say that. They're still figuring out some stuff with it, but it's just too cool not to talk about. So I'm just going to start up the dev server real quick. And cool. Okay, so this is using the app directory and React Query's experimental hydration package. So this package, it allows you to fetch data on the server in a client component, that's important, by using the use query hook with suspense set to true or the use suspense query hook in your component. And similar to that multiple suspense example, results will be streamed from the server to the client as suspense boundaries resolve. So let's look at some of that code. This should look fairly familiar. Let me go back. Okay, so you see DevTools already opened up, but all right, I have some artificial lag added here. I have a bunch of routes. So this is a server component. This is a client component, but let's go in. Let's look at our root of our app. This should look familiar from the React Query example, but we have some providers here, and our providers have this query client. And again, I need a hook here in order to hoist that query client to stay the same on each render on the server. So I have it marked as a client component because I need client-side JavaScript. We're wrapping the entire app in our query client provider, and we have our dev tools, but the main difference here is we have this React Query streamed hydration package. This is kind of the secret sauce for working with Next.js 13's suspense boundaries and streaming effectively. This is what's going to allow us to stream data and trigger suspense boundaries really easily. So let's look at the root page. So here, I have it marked as a client component, and I don't know why I decided to go with use router instead of link. I was just looking to change things up a little bit. And I have this abstracted hook that looks similar to what I did before in React Query. The difference being here, I've added some artificial lag, but the other one is I'm using the use suspense query instead. So let's do this real quick. I'm going to reload the page. Notice how it's loading, like it's waiting for the entire page to load, and then it's done, right? This use suspense post query, it's throwing a promise and the nearest suspense boundary, which in this case is our general loading state for the entire app, is getting triggered. So it's without needing to use a server component, I could trigger suspense to go off, which is pretty cool. And one really cool thing is, if I look at DevTools real quick, so right now the data's stale, right? So I have three routes total that are going to demonstrate this: home, more posts, and more posts with suspense. What's kind of cool is if I click on more posts, that's going to have a client-side JavaScript bundle get loaded. But if I keep going back and forth, so again, it's only loading because of the JavaScript bundle, it's all in the same cache. Like notice that there's no flashing. It's all sharing the exact same cache, so you're getting caching occurring, but you also have the option that if the data goes stale, ideally it will trigger a suspense boundary if something happens again. So we're able to keep triggering a refetch, which is really nice. So if we look at the code for that, we have more posts, which is just using our use post get post query before. Under the hood, it's using get posts under the hood, just the use query hook. And if we look at more post suspense, it's using literally the same code as before. It just is using the use get suspense get post query, but it resolves immediately because it has data in the cache, which is really nice. So we're not triggering suspense then. And now, looking at a similar example to before, this code should not look that unfamiliar to you. If I go to multiple suspense, it's going to trigger off slowly, and it's going to stream in each post. And if we look at the code for that, so again, looks the same. We have some artificial sleep here. I don't know why I didn't abstract this out. I think I wanted to keep it a little more readable at this point of the talk. And we have some props for the ID and the wait in milliseconds. The use suspense query goes off. And again, we have these each wrapped in suspense, so we're able to trigger the suspense boundaries with these client component hooks. So this is a great option if you're not fully bought into you doing server components, but you want the benefits of like the app directory to do loading states and error states for you. It just gives you an easy way to kind of get some of those benefits without going all in on server components at that point. So hold on one sec. And I believe that covers it in terms of the demo. So we're going to go back to slides and hopefully round this out. And to be clear, I will be here in this room afterwards. If you want to like fight me on any of this code, talk to me about how wrong I am all ears. All ears. So let's go. So all of these are awesome, but one of the things that comes to mind is like, how do you make a decision on what to use? So I'm a huge Excalibron fanboy. For those that don't use it, it's like one of my favorite things on the internet right now. You can do charts really easily. So this is kind of my decision-making chart right now, and there are going to be some asterisks we're going to talk through. So if I were using Next.js, I would probably be reaching for server components, but probably not the mutation part because that's still getting figured out. I might reach for React Query for that. Or honestly, I'm praying and hoping that the React Query team gets that package out of experimental, and I would probably just use that because you get caching built in. You don't really have to get bought into Next caching mechanisms, which I think are a little weird when you're monkey patching fetch. I found that to be a little more ergonomic and nice. If I weren't using Next.js and I were using Redux, I would use Redux Toolkit Query. And if I were not using Redux, I would use React Query. And the main thing I want to drive home here is to use the tool that makes sense for your project. I am not telling you to go out and like gut your entire project and use server components. I'm not telling you to add Redux to your project, to use Redux Toolkit Query. And I'm not telling you to add React Query if you're already using Redux. Use the tool that has the least amount of effort to get the biggest bang for your buck here. Okay. And some parting thoughts, if possible, avoid using the use effect or old school Redux to fetch data. Utilize any of these awesome tools instead. Server state management is very different and complex, and honestly, mere mortals should not be handling that. So offload it to a team that has been doing this very effectively. I would also encourage you that all these approaches are awesome, so you kind of can't go wrong in a lot of ways on them. And we should thank every open source software contributor for these tools because it is thankless work. It's really hard to get right, and it is just that whole industry is riddled with burnout. So if you ever meet one of those guys or gals, thank them. They're awesome. And again, use the right tool for your team's problems. Don't strong arm a tool into your project if you can help it. You'll get bitten in the butt pretty bad. So just want to thank all of you for your time today. You guys are all awesome, and yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming. Cool. Thanks, y'all. Oh, sure. Yeah, we can do Q&A. Cool.
Since the last conference here that we attended, we started using SWR.
Yeah, that's a valid option.
At the time, we were trying to figure out which one to use, and it was kind of like SWR is recommended because it seemed more lightweight or simple. But over a year, there's been a lot of, they've added new functionality. What would be some of the best if you were to recommend one over another, or React Query in this case, because that's one that you've shown, what would be the thing that would be a good selling point if I were to try to advocate for that change?
Man, that's a great question. Are you in like platform work or something like that, where you're thinking you're just fighting the good fight? I like that. So I would probably encourage you to talk to your team about just like what your caching strategy is, and like if you feel like SWR is meeting that or not. That's usually like a big selling point for React Query is like the ergonomics of their, like you only have to learn 3 hooks. I think SWR uses like a very minimal amount of hooks also. I think the developer experience on it too, like I think one thing I've done when I've ended up in a situation where a tool isn't the most ergonomic for developer experience is I like will demo out what it looks like code-wise. Like I would literally write the same component in SWR versus React Query and see how your team feels about it, because ultimately like our goal is to make sure as engineers we're enabling each other to do their jobs effectively. So if someone on your team is happy with SWR and then there's someone that like everyone else hates it, like they're gonna have a come to Jesus moment about that and figure out what makes sense for all of you to work in realistically. Does that help?
I think generally that's that makes sense, and
Yeah.
that might be a good way to also maybe I can see what the differences are for like I know one of the big things was like how to see what the cache state was.
Oh yeah, the dev tooling on React, actually I will say that's a huge selling point. The dev tooling is so good.
We were used to like Redux form, or Redux state, where we could kind of always see the state in our.
Yeah, I have to admit, I actually recently moved some stuff out of Redux, and I had someone that was me like, can we get dev tools for this one thing? It's like, not everyone has that. So yeah, React Query does have that though. So yeah, good selling point. Anyone else have any questions? I wasn't expecting Q&A actually, so this is cool. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no. I'll be up here if anyone wants to hang out and talk. Thank you guys for coming.